French influence on English. English, as we know it today, has a very interesting history. It didn't develop on its own into the complicated mess of words we know today. Rather, it had influence from many different languages and incorporated several elements of these languages, including grammar styles and other words. Arguably, the language that influenced English the most, French, came into England through the context of conquest, and it has had a lasting effect on the English language over time.
So Britain around 1000 years CE was a jumbled mess of people trying to get the throne to themselves. The chaos was a result of the death of the Saxon king Edward the Confessor. Edward died without an heir, so William, the Duke of Normandy, was supposed to take the throne because he was Edward's cousin. But the Saxon people wanted to have a Saxon ruler, so they put Harold of Wessex on the throne instead. William didn't like this, of course. He wanted to be king too, so he gathered an army and planned to fight for the crown. But William wasn't the only one. A Viking from the north also wanted to be king of England. Another Harold, Harold of Norway, invaded England from the north. And Harold of Wessex won the battle, but his army was weakened. And William chose this time to lead his army in from the south. Harold's exhausted army didn't hold up too well against William, so William ended up winning the Battle of Hastings and gained control of England, which earned him the title William the Conqueror. Normandy and England were then under one king, which resulted in English having quite a bit of influence from the Norman French. So, who were the Normans exactly? Well, Normans were actually descendants of Vikings, but then they moved to France and adopted the French language and just completely abandoned its Old Norse language, because not one Norse word was spoken in Normandy. Instead, they spoke a rural dialect of French that was pretty heavily influenced by German called Norman French. So because of William of Normandy became the king, Norman French became the language of kings and aristocrats, essentially the high language. And the majority of England still spoke English, about 90%, 95% of them, but mostly they were peasants and lower class people with little political power. So English was considered a lowly and vulgar language. The two languages coexist for a while, but they eventually merged. The new merged language is referred to as Middle English.
The emergence of Middle English began in 1250 when French began to lose some of its prestige as a language spoken by the wealthy. The problem was that the new king, Edward, only spoke English. Coupled with the influx of foreigners moving to England, many of the aristocrats who originally spoke French decided to learn English. This was due to many of the working class population already speaking English. The aristocrats wanted to be more like other Englishmen, so they took up English as their primary language. With the new support of the aristocrats and nobles now speaking English, it rapidly began to gain power and influence. However, the rich still kept their knowledge of French. They still wanted to preserve some of their past knowledge. It was only till the 100-Year War with France before French became pretty hated in England. However, even after the 100-Year War, French was still found in the English language. English had decided to take about 10,000 French words and use them as a part of their own language. What happened was, over time, some of the French originally spoken by the aristocrats made it into the English language. When the French speakers learned English, they mixed some of the new French words into English. Over a period of time, regular English-speaking people picked up these new words and decided to use them. Then, this trend began to snowball and eventually ended up as an official part of English. In 1362, all of these new changes, plus all the old English words, became part of England's official language when the government created the Statute of Queen that made English Britain's official language.
So, the English language is very much like a chain of borrowings due to the frequent invasions of various outsiders. When William, the Duke of Normandy, crowned himself as King of England, the upper class started to speak French, while the lower classes retained the English language. This was probably related to the fact that William only spoke French. So the people who were closer to him, and in this case it was the upper class, followed his language to show their loyalty and support for better connections. King William was more likely to give property or power to a noble or lord that spoke his language rather than someone who spoke English. In the 10,000 words that were borrowed into the English language from the Normans, many were typically government, economy, nobility, war, combat, law, social, and the arts related. As you can tell, these subjects aren't really everyday peasant people matters, so it makes sense for the majority of the higher or refined words to be borrowed from French, because it was the upper class that used the language. Government-related words include parliament, government, and city. Authority-related words include servant, empire, and money. Our English word money directly comes from the French monnaie. Baron, noble, and castle and prince are examples of nobility-related words. Many of the words having to do with the law were also heavily influenced by French, such as justice, attorney, plaintiff, and felony. Most likely as a result of many French-borrowed judicial words, the legal system also retained parts of the language's word order, where the adjective follows the noun. Since the upper class primarily spoke French, the words in the social life and arts categories were also borrowed from the Normans. It was really only rich people who could afford the money and time to invest in education, literature, cuisine, and the arts. Fashion, cuisine, collage, and literature are examples of the many words that the English borrowed from the French. A lot of the architectural terms used today also have French origins, such as terrace and pavilion. On the topic of cuisine, various food names were also adopted into the language, like meringue, croissant, and pastry. The idea of French as more of a refined and elegant language also impacted the origins for the words of jobs and animals. The lower or humble trades retained their Anglo-Saxon names, such as baker, miller, and shoemaker, whereas the more skilled trades adopted French names like mason, painter, tailor, and merchant. The same idea applied to animals in the field and animals once they were cooked and served. The former kept their English names, sheep, cow, and swine, while the latter developed French-related names like mutton, beef, and pork. The historical context of England heavily impacted which words were and weren't borrowed from the French. Colloquial and ordinary matters typically retained their Anglo-Saxon names, while matters of higher importance and refinery were given French names. However, sometimes the French and Old English components combined to form new words and doublets emerged.
Some words that came from French didn't completely replace English words. Sometimes words that had around the same meaning in both languages both survived in English. Many English words now have synonyms that actually come from French, like child, which came from Old English, has the synonym infant, which came from French, or the word friendship, which has the French counterpart amity. These pairs of synonyms are referred to as doublets. A general trend that one can see among the words listed is that the French words are much less used in common speech. In a conversation with a person in real life, you would never say, "I desire for our amity to commence." Instead, the actual sentence would be sort of like, "I want to be friends." The English words are much more colloquial, simple, and commonly used in everyday speech, while the French words are more scholarly and have the connotation of being more refined and intellectual. These trends we notice in the English language can be explained by looking at the historical context in which French influenced English. At the time, England was under political rule under different kings who didn't even speak English. Because of this, only the peasants and lower people spoke the dialect of Old English, while the aristocrats and kings spoke French. Eventually, the dialect of Old English spoken by the peasants became more and more simplified, while the aristocratic community kept speaking French. This can explain the pattern of words that came from Old English being simpler and more colloquial, and the French words being more scholarly and long. Since the peasants spoke Old English, words that came from Old English would certainly become more used in daily conversations. Similarly, words that came from French were being used in the higher parts of society, and so they eventually passed on to modern English as more academic and not really used among the majority of the population. Much of the English language can be attributed to the influence of French on the English language. While we don't think of English as a French-based language today, it certainly has incorporated French words and systems.